Welcome to Corporate Cafecito,
a Latin and business podcast where we share insights and strategies to help entrepreneurs and professionals thrive. Welcome back to another episode of Corporate Cafecito. Yo soy Carlos Butler Valle.
Y yo soy Nayeli Suarez Gas. Today we have just a big focus of something that you're probably hearing a lot in the news, maybe in the workplace. It's, to be honest, when I think about it, it feels very scary to me. And that is DE&I and the switch in the initiatives that are actively in corporate America.
Yeah, and one of the things that I get asked a lot about is, it felt like it started in higher education, and now it's really starting to kind of happen in government. And the next question is, how is this going to potentially impact us in corporate America? And I think particularly what we get from Latinos is questions around how to navigate this environment, because the reality is that DE&I has been, for better or for worse, politicized. And so, there is this element of, how do I navigate this without necessarily myself getting involved in the politics? But what's the balance? It feels like a tightrope. And then, a lot of questions around what's next too. So looking forward to diving into this topic. I think to start, if it's okay, it's probably important to just talk about what was the reasoning or the rationale behind DE&I programs in this to start.
And then DE&I stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yep, absolutely.
And you're right. A lot of these efforts started, you're a DE.
Yeah, actually, but I'm curious to know. I'm curious to hear from you.
Well, it's funny. Why don't I ask you a couple questions?
Okay, sounds good.
Because we've had ERG groups forever, employee resource groups or business resource groups. How was that different from DE&I?
Yeah, I would say ERG groups are a way that DE&I materializes, and so at its core, and even in ERG groups, there have been some evolutions. One of the questions, again, that we get asked is, how is this impacting corporate America? Yeah. And one of the things that I will say is that one of my pieces of advice to folks is that you want to make sure your ERGs are inclusive, not exclusive. And so what that means is there was a point in the life of ERGs where it was very explicitly prohibited, for example, for a man to be, or someone who identifies as a man, to be part of a women's employee resource group. And
we actually made a joke because we had the African American ERG, we had the Latino ERG, we had the Asian ERG, we had the LGBTQ ERG. And then, and when we would have like conventions or big sales meetings, everyone would go to their ERG, and then you just have the white men left in the place, and we're like, but they can form a group.
Yeah, exactly. And that is, again, part of, I think, a lot of what you're seeing.
It should not be exclusive.
It should not be exclusive. It should be, one of the things that we did when I worked at Groupon is that we would call it, Hispanics at Groupon or Latinx at Groupon and allies. So we literally rebranded every single one of our business resource groups or employee resource groups to make sure that it was explicitly known that allies could be a part of this group, because there were folks who were maybe white women who were married to Hispanic men who wanted to be a part of the Hispanic resource group because they had kids that were half white, or because they wanted to figure out how they were going to support their partner, and otherwise they would not have had those opportunities.
So then how did DE&I start? Because it felt like it was a position that was created not too long ago.
Well, so that is part of the misconception, and we talked about perceptions actually in one of our previous podcasts. But yeah, DE&I has been around for, I think, a long time. I think what you are specifically mentioning is the rise of the chief diversity officer in the C-suite, right?
Exactly what I'm.
Yeah,
and just like the DEI title
focus. Just all of a sudden you're having offices of DE&I or DE&I teams that didn't necessarily always exist. I would say you typically tended to find a lot of that in HR functions, particularly where there was a focus maybe on talent development or even something like culture and engagement.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that sort of transformed. And I think what we saw when after post the George Floyd murder was that there needed to be a focus on this in the workplace. There needed to be a dedicated team to ensure that we were looking at this cross-functionally, so that DE&I, or the concepts of DE&I, weren't just living within the DE&I team or just the HR team, because in my case, I've been a part of both. I've been a D&I leader in HR teams, and I've been a D&I leader outside of HR teams. And I could say they both have some great benefits and both have some challenges. But it was, how are we thinking about inclusion in terms of access for people to get talent development? How is it that we're looking at belonging and what that means for safety in the workplace, particularly in a manufacturing environment where safety is number one, where we want to make sure that people are focused on what they're doing and not focused on what they're scared of or what they might be fearing or what they might be experiencing at home that might be influencing them here. And so there was a true where what I feel like what we saw was kind of a splintering of DE&I, where a lot of it, and this could be seen as potentially controversial by some people, but I stand pretty firmly by it, where there were D&I practitioners that were really focused on the business case, and so we're starting to sort of lead with that, which was, how do we avoid costly lawsuits by ensuring that we're being thoughtful about where we recruit and who
Yes.
and how we retain and how we train and how we develop and how we onboard people and how we offboard people, right? Because there is a legal risk, obviously, to these things. And then there's also the aspect of, how are we using diverse perspectives to innovate? How are we using diverse perspectives to market, more effectively and efficiently? How are we, using diverse perspectives to think about technology in a different way, right? And so that's where that's kind of where one area went. And then part of what you're seeing today is a little bit the backlash to what I would call more sort of the academic, which was really, how do corporations under sort of the corporate social responsibility arm oftentimes recognize how they contributed to some of these systemic quote issues, and where can corporations potentially leverage some of these CSR initiatives to support communities and initiatives like social justice and equity. And so that's where I think you're seeing,
That's where, yeah, you're right. Because, I think about, so when we think of DE&I, the first thing you think of is race.
Yes.
And the reality is DE&I does so much more, now that my mom is in a wheelchair, like the ADA is very DE&I. It's about accessibility. It's about restaurants having ramps. It's about her being, that's part of DE&I.
Absolutely.
That's part of the E.
Yeah.
Right. And the I. The other thing is maternity leave is very much a DE&I initiative.
Absolutely.
In terms of, because diversity is also women. It's also gender. It goes beyond just the race. When I think about what I see in the news, it feels like race is the first thing they identify.
Yeah, and again, that's where it's the politicization, I think, has actually really, unfortunately, created some of that, I think, misconception, because the way that I think about DE&I is, it's everything that you bring to the table, and how do we create spaces and opportunities to harness that. And it could be that we have an opportunity to market this particular product to white men in their 40s. And in that case, that is a diverse perspective that we would potentially need. But it could also be that there's this really great product that we're innovating on that we feel is going to be a really great, point of connection with Hispanic consumers. And I'm not going to necessarily go to that same group of people to get some of that advice and feedback, right? We want to make sure that we're doing some of that. But that is one element of it. You know, when you think about things like regionality, even in the U.S., for example, right? East Coast, West Coast, very different. Midwest, very different. You know, you think about North, you think about South. You know, there's obviously some of that. Age, obviously, is an aspect of diversity that we bring to the table. Some of that comes with tenure. Some of that comes with age. Some of that comes with maybe a career shift. You know, and what are we learning from that perspective? Um, you know, even your home makeup growing up could be a diverse element. I didn't necessarily grow up in a home where there were two parents or two sets of parents all the time. Um, my daughter is growing up in a same-sex household, and so, you know, or with same-sex parents, and so that already in and of itself is going to give her a different perspective necessarily. And so I'm glad that you brought it up, that you brought that up, because I think that's what we've been sort of led to think, is that this is mostly about race and
Right.
ethnicity,
But
when
it's
in reality
everything.
it's so many
It
different
advocates for
things.
so many. And I think
Absolutely.
about, autism's been in the news a lot lately, but
Yes.
DE&I protects autistic children and
Absolutely.
adults,
Yeah.
and creates opportunities for them. So when I think about like DE&I, and I think about like what it meant, like for me, um, it was very symbolic to see roles dedicated to bringing that kind of DEI, like bringing it to life or
Focus.
just
Yeah.
celebrating it. To me,
Yeah.
it felt like we had an advocate in different corporations that was looking out to make sure there were, Latin vendors considered, or
Yes.
a Latina or a Latino in the realm of being interviewed,
Yeah,
that they
absolutely.
were bringing enough diversity of thought into
Yeah.
rooms that everyone didn't look the same or experience things the same way. And
That's
so
exactly right.
I felt a great sadness as I see these rollbacks for these initiatives going away.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that I think has been really interesting is that I do feel most folks are actually, if they start to really think about the business value of what we're talking about, most folks would actually 100% be on board with, particularly if it's a publicly traded company, on board with the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In some cases, I just saw recently that there was a big bank that changed DE&I to DO&I, so
Oh, yes,
diversity,
I saw.
opportunity, and inclusion.
And so it's okay. Thank you for saying that, because someone told me they were like, look for the DE&I. It's going to be under different names.
Yes.
And you were saying that earlier today.
Yeah.
You were like, it
Yep.
may be culture and this
It
and
could be
this.
culture and engagement. It could
Yeah.
be, yeah, it could be positive employee relations. It
Because
could
I think
be
that
any number of
companies see the
things.
value in this. You
Absolutely.
have to see the value in addressing a full market or talking to everyone. And, yeah.
This is why I don't understand. I think if anybody says to me, and I'm trying to hold back, if anyone says to me that they are a free market, you know, capitalist, then I would say this is exactly what you should be trying to encourage,
Right.
because at the end of the day, organizations are out there, and you know this well from having worked in both the sales, and I think you even had a stint in the marketing and the brand element, and you're doing this obviously right now with Drop Needle. But like, there are products out there to be consumed. There is a
Yes.
fight constantly for dollar share gain, and why not, you know, take the opportunity to do this? This is probably going to sound very crass, but like, I say to my close friends, like, there's a reason why you don't see me designing feminine hygiene products. I've never
We
personally,
don't have the
I don't have the
experience.
experience. You would not want me. I really, really sincerely believe that you would not want Carlos Butler Valle designing or even figuring out how to market or any of these other things, because I don't know what it's like. If I'm going to have a conversation about that, because I work at a company that designs these products, I'm going to make sure that I'm bringing that perspective into the room,
Yes.
because I realize that women are so. If I took a look at the number of women that existed across the globe and access, right, and the necessity for these products, I would realize that if I was a company that made these things, I would want to make sure that I'm making the best damn product out there, and that I'm going to the places and spaces where this is going to resonate with people, right?
Yes.
And so there are limits, there are limitations, I think, and that's really what we're trying to do, is to just acknowledge that there are limitations, but also within that an infinite number of opportunities, as long as we have these perspectives at the table. I don't know.
Like,
What do you think?
preach.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Well, it's interesting because when I coach, I always tell people, like, I recommend that, like, you get a mentor and that you work with your management team, et cetera. And I'm like, I can only teach you what I know.
Yeah.
After that, you're only as good as me.
Yeah.
But if you reach out to someone else and then someone else and then someone else and keep building your skill set and keep building your network, then you're like you're a mesh of
Yes,
everybody, and you're going to
absolutely.
be smarter and keep going. And and so I think if we think of DE&I, it's like, unless you have this vast majority, you're only going to be as good as the people you have in the room.
Absolutely. There's this really great, and I think it's by Talent Pop, if I'm not mistaken. There is this really great piece of research that has been done, that for every element of diversity that you bring to a decision-making table, you increase the chances of actually coming up with a profitable idea. Right? And so if you bring in 5 different elements of DE9,
Yeah,
so again,
it
let's talk
scales,
about it. It's
yeah.
not just race and ethnicity. It could be gender, it could be age, it could be regionality, it could be any of these things. You get closer to, like,
A
I think it's
full
like an 83 or
representation.
85% chance of actually making a better decision. And there's no more important daily task in a corporate environment than decisions and decision making. And
Yes.
so when we think about that, it makes it, it makes it hard, I think, for people like me to sort of wrap our heads around where the discourse has gone. I will say, though, one of the things that I think is really cool, and this is being led a lot by, I think, Latinos and also particularly Black and African American folks, is that the pushback is coming. And the pushback, I think, has already been here. And so there's the anti-DEI backlash, that I think is starting to happen. Just today, I read that, Target sales are down 9% year over year. And obviously there are a number of factors, but foot traffic particularly has gone down. And when you're looking at the products that particularly, people of color, underrepresented folks are buying, people are buying less of those products. And so they're starting to create, I think, a closer kind of, and this is not to pick on anyone.
That correlation needs to exist, right? Of our dollars, where we put our dollars. Because
100%.
where you put your dollars is what you believe in.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And, it's interesting because before that used to be mostly a generational thing. And now we're starting actually to see that across the board, where people are starting to say, if you're not focused on hiring, promoting people like me,
buying or leveraging vendors that look like me,
supporting organizations and causes that are important to people like me, I'm not going to give you my money. And I think there's something there to be said. Now, one of the questions I get a lot particularly from Latino employees, is, what does this mean for me?
Yeah.
And I think we need to be really open and honest about that, because the reality is that part of what we're seeing is a rollback, a cutback in particularly development programs for Hispanic, Latinx folks, and Latin folks. And so that has real implications, folks. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It could obviously potentially impact promotability. We talked about in one of our episodes, influence and access, because part of the value in being in places and spaces like that is to develop a network of other people of color, other underrepresented folks that were also trying to achieve career growth, advancement, upward mobility, generational wealth, right? But, the other thing is, a lot of these programs were looked at for succession planning. And so if they don't necessarily exist, you're not getting that same level of visibility.
So you have to make yourself more visible.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit, just like maybe one thing that people can do in lieu of having these types of opportunities?
You can stop being humble.
Okay.
You can start talking about what you do, how you do it, how you are the best at what you do, which is so important. We're not visible if we keep our nose down. You have to get your, la frente en alto. Like, go walk with your head held high and tell people what it is you do and why you did it and how you're the best at doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're 100% right. I think the humility factor, particularly for Latin folks, is obviously very high. And so one of the things that I used to do whenever I was at a place that didn't necessarily have things like this is, again, you and I have talked about the fact that most of what's said about you is said when you're not in the room. If I knew that there was somebody that was going to be in the room, that's true. If I knew that there was going to be somebody in the room where I wasn't necessarily going to be, I stopped hesitating to say, hey, Nayeli, could you please give me a good word of, a good recommendation to so-and-so, or, at this meeting, could you mention maybe something that I had done? Because more often than not, I realized that people were more than happy to do that. They just didn't even think to do that necessarily.
Well, yes, we have to find their cheerleaders.
Yes.
They need to speak about us in those rooms. We also have to be the cheerleaders for others.
Absolutely.
And that means that, like, you may be the one in power. You may be the one in that position. Like, hype up your friends. Like, hype up the people who are doing a good job. Hype up, be that person that brings them into that room.
Yes.
And also bring up the next person with you.
I agree 100%.
And you can also go to all these organizations and just, like, be part of them, right? If you can't find DE&I at your job, find it outside of your job.
Yeah.
Form your networks.
Absolutely.
Be part of those groups that really highlight and move Latins up. And when we talk about just being like, I know I already am missing some of the DE&I professionals who I've seen have been, let go or severed from their companies. Like, help them out, reach out to them, advertise. A lot of their skill sets are very cross-functional.
Yeah.
It's a people person.
I love everything you said. I think to encapsulate it, like, it's, relationship building and finding that cheerleader, finding that sponsor. I think, you talked about this, but oftentimes, even if there are no longer DE&I teams or they don't exist in the same capacity, most organizations still, at least at this point, have employee resource groups. So leverage your employee resource groups to continue to get access and influence and, invitations to certain things where maybe leaders could be, where they can still hear some of the thoughts that you might potentially have. This is a really, really, really big one. Speak in leadership's language. There were often times where I would be in rooms where people would say, yeah, but you're trying to go after Latinos and it's important to make sure that there's Latino representation. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but talk about why it's essential for profitability and innovation.
Yeah, bring it to the numbers.
Bring it to the numbers. Talk very specifically about this.
The advice is get as close to the cash as possible.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So even in the example where I was talking about, where about feminine hygiene products, maybe I'm not the person necessarily to talk about product innovation or anything like that. But I can absolutely see an opportunity. If I see that there are certain groups of folks that maybe have less access to these types of things, or, there are new markets that are potentially popping up, and maybe there's something that we're missing, I could absolutely leverage that information to say it's essential for us to make sure that we have Latin representation when we're talking about these things, because there's a potential profitability impact of X. Or whatever that might be, but don't just talk about the nice to have, or don't always position it as, well, if you're going after Latinos, you need to do it. Well, no,
Put it
I
in
think
Spanish.
most people
You're
know,
like, that's not, it can't just be, that can't be it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was at a company once where they decided that they were going to create a Spanish Super Bowl commercial. I won't name which company. And it looked like it was straight up a Google Translate.
You're like, no.
Oh, it was
the Google Translates are the
bad.
worst.
And thankfully it was our brought to our Hispanic business resource group, and at that point we were able to salvage it.
Stop.
It was a timeout for a Super Bowl commercial, and in the end we were able to give a great business reason as to why it was important to make sure that you had the representation there to start, because it was by pure accident. Actually, it was an executive sponsor who was there who said, something feels off about this commercial. Have we run it past the employee resource group, the Hispanic employee resource group? And
they were like,
they were like, no, we hadn't done that yet.
That's a good idea.
But it was because they knew that they had really great people that they can count on, who were active, who were involved, who were in these other informal networks, that were able to go there and provide that feedback, that he felt comfortable enough to go back to the group to say, hey, we need your help with this. And then I would say there's always ways to advocate for inclusion in ways that don't necessarily trigger DEI backlash. So don't talk about it, to your point, necessarily about race or ethnicity. One of the things that I always think about you is that you are part of that sandwich generation where you're taking care of an elderly parent who has now gone into being wheelchair bound, and that is a whole new set of challenges for you. But you're no longer just a parent, which, by the way, is an important DE&I identity. But now you are also a caretaker. So if there's a product that you have, for example, or a service that where there's an opportunity to provide, talk about it from that perspective, because there are so many of us who know someone who may be wheelchair bound or who may have some sort of disability, that we're always so focused on race and ethnicity. And again, not that we don't need to keep the focus, but that's not all encompassing. Yeah. So how do you do that? And then think about the fact, if you arm yourself with the data and say, the number of Latinos going into this stage in their life is X, and there's a market opportunity there that we're not capturing, to bring it back to that profitability and innovation, that's how you are still advocating for this work without necessarily triggering some of that backlash.
100%. So this has been a lot. We have a lot of feelings about this, obviously, because it is
good feelings.
Yeah. But also very sad feelings.
Yeah, that's true.
I think it's really fair to say, like, it has been something that has changed, and, I don't know if it could be for the better. We'll just kind of wait and see. But until then, we don't have to sit on our laurels. We could do something. We could be advocates for each other. We can continue getting training. We can continue to give feedback, and we continue to promote ourselves and others, so that we are visible and that people can see us and see who we really are.
Yeah, and we'll make sure to post, I think, some of these too on when we release the episode. But there are some really great organizations out there that focus on development for multiple groups, but they're also specifically for Hispanics, for Latins. So you think about organizations like ACE, the Hispanic Alliance for Career Enhancement. You think about the National Hispanic, it's NHCC, the National Corporate,
the Chambers of Commerce,
the Chambers of Commerce. You've got the Alphas,
we'll put all of those on there so that you have resources as well, and you know who to reach out to.
And some of those are free of charge. They could be at a relatively low, price point, but it's important for you to stay involved and to stay engaged. And I think Nayeli was right. If it's not going to necessarily happen within your workplace, figure out a way to
find it outside your workplace.
Find it outside your workplace. So listen, friends, we've left you with a lot of thoughts, but hopefully good things. And, it's not all despair. As I mentioned, there is, I think, a wave coming back where we're saying, maybe we're pushing back a little, maybe we went a little too far. You can be a part of that change too every day. And until then, obviously, we continue to root for you, and we want to make sure that you continue to be as successful as possible through our Corporate Cafecito podcast.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us. Yo soy Nayeli Suarez Gas.
Y yo soy Carlos Butler Vale. Hasta pronto.
Bye.